In Read Naturally Live, many of the steps can be customized to fit the needs of individual students by using story options. To access story options, log in and click Read Naturally Live. Then select one or more students and click Change Story Options. You can also open story options while you're working with the student by using the Teacher menu. In the following examples, you'll see how to customize the steps. Specifically, you'll see how to turn off steps, how to allow a student to independently conduct cold timings, and how to adjust the number of required read-alongs. You'll also see how to change the duration of timings. When you enroll a student, all the steps in the program are enabled. If you think a student would make better progress by skipping a step, you can turn that step off. For example, Rachel Monroe is having difficulty with the prediction and retell steps because she types very slowly. So Rachel's teacher, Paul Ramos, has decided to turn off these steps. Instead, he'll ask Rachel to write her prediction in a notebook and orally retell the story. Rachel has just started a new story. The progress bar shows that she's on the keyword step. Paul wants to turn off the next step, prediction, as well as the retell step. Paul takes the mouse and clicks Teacher. He logs in by entering his user ID and password. Then he clicks Change Story Options. The Story Options screen lists the steps that can be customized. Paul clicks the prediction switch to turn off that step. He turns off the retell step too. He clicks Save to apply the changes. Notice that the prediction and retell steps are now labeled Off in the progress bar. These steps will be turned off for this story and all Rachel's future stories unless Paul turns the steps back on in Story Options. When Rachel clicks Next, the software skips over the prediction and moves on to the next step. Another customization you can make is to specify whether a teacher must conduct cold timings. By default, a teacher is required for the cold timing. During this step, teachers check to see if each student's placement is appropriate, especially in the first few stories. Teachers also coach students to accurately identify their errors. Many teachers prefer to be present for the cold timing, but once a student can identify errors with reasonable accuracy, the student can do this step independently without waiting for the teacher. During the cold timing step, Paul's been coaching Rachel on how to identify her errors. Even though he was present, she marked her own errors, and Paul pointed out any that she missed. During the last few stories, Paul's seen that Rachel is proficient in identifying her own errors. He thinks she's ready to time herself independently, so Paul opens story options for Rachel. Under cold timing, he sets Teacher Required to No, and then saves his changes. Notice that now Rachel can begin her cold timing immediately. The read-along step can be customized in several ways. Teachers can turn off the step, select the number of read-alongs a student must perform, and for some levels, select a Spanish read-along. This option may be appropriate for some native Spanish speakers who are learning to read in English. Let's return to our student, Rachel Monroe, to see how to adjust the number of read-alongs. It's now later in the year. With the support of Read Naturally Live, Rachel is reading stories at a level that is half a year above her grade level. For each story, she still reads along with the audio and practices several times. Paul has decided it's time to remove some of Rachel's audio support to prepare her to graduate from Read Naturally Live. Rachel is at the read-along step, and she's required to complete the default number of read-alongs, 3. Paul opens Rachel's story options to reduce the number of read-alongs required. Teachers can select from 0 to 5 required read-alongs for each student. Each story has been recorded at 3 different speeds, and each reading is slightly faster than the last. If a student is only completing one read-along, the teacher can select the speed. Otherwise, the software automatically sets the appropriate pace for each read-along. Paul selects the minimum number of times he wants Rachel to read along. Since Rachel is completing 2 read-alongs, the software automatically sets her speeds to the medium and expressive rates. If Rachel's teacher wanted her to read along with a Spanish translation of the story first, he would turn on the Spanish read-along. Setting the Spanish read-along option requires a student to read along with or listen to a Spanish translation of the story before the English read-along. On the read-along step, Rachel sees that now she has to complete only 2 read-alongs. In story options, you can also adjust the timing options for students. Typically, students practice for 1 minute at a time. 1-minute timings keep students motivated by highlighting their immediate improvement. However, some of your students might benefit from 2-minute or whole story timings, especially those who are struggling with comprehension. For example, you might want older students working in higher levels to read for longer, more sustained periods. 2-minute timings work well in this situation. You can use whole story timings anytime you want your students to read the entire story. If you choose this option, pay attention to your students' motivation. Some students lose their motivation when required to read the entire story many times. To change the type of timing, go to Story Options. In the practice step, select a duration and save the changes. If you change the practice duration, the hot timing duration will also change to match.